Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In 1920, Scientific American wrote an article fertilizing the air with carbon dioxide to promote plant growth. They showed how you could get huge increases in crop yields by piping carbon dioxide from industrial facilities into agricultural facilities. And 100 years ago in 1922, Dr. Riedel, a German scientist, demonstrated the same thing. He said the world's greatest problem was our inability to produce enough food, and the easiest way to solve it would be by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These scientists 100 years ago were correct. NASA has confirmed that carbon dioxide fertilization has made Earth much greener. Over the past 60 years, wheat yields around the world have tripled. In the United States, over the last 80 years, corn yields are up by a factor of 5. Over the last century, life expectancy around the world has doubled. Malnutrition has plummeted to record lows. Poverty has also plummeted to record lows. Illiteracy has plummeted to record lows. Death rates from all types of natural disasters, including meteorological and climate events, are down 95% over the last century. Everything has gotten much better over the last century for humans, including the climate. Scientific American was absolutely correct about the benefits of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere when they published this article in 1920. But now Scientific American says Earth is on fire, and they say that we broke the atmosphere by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Things have gotten much better for humans, so it's pretty clear that Scientific American's agenda has changed over the last 100 years. And if we go back to the year 1969, it becomes clear what's going on. The agenda was no longer to feed the world. The new agenda was to decrease population. In 1969, the United Nations, academics, and the New York Times were openly talking about poisoning the food and water supply in third world countries. They said birth control was going to have to become involuntary, and they were going to have to sterilize people by poisoning the food and water supply. And they said that if we didn't do this, there was going to be a dire famine by the year 1975. The oceans would be dead by the year 1980, and America would be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. I started college in 1974, and I don't seem to remember any water or food rationing. In July 1969, the United States landed on the moon. And then a few weeks later, the second most powerful hurricane in U.S. history hit the Louisiana coast.
They called it the American Riviera, the loveliest beach in the South. Now, hurricane winds seldom top 120 miles an hour. Camille's have reached 200, tornado intensity, but cutting a wider swath than any tornado that ever lived. From Biloxi to Bay St. Louis, everything's in shambles.
And this week in 1969, the White House started fear-mongering about global warming. They said that by the year 2000, the world was going to warm 7 degrees and New York and Washington were going to drown. Washington politicians keep making promises which they never deliver on. But back in the real world, scientists were worried about why the Arctic climate was becoming more frigid. They said Arctic sea ice was becoming ominously thicker and wondered whether the extent of that ice cover contributed to the onset of ice ages. Scientists wanted to sprinkle dark coal dust on the ice pack in order to melt it. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators wrote a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century.
British professor Hubert Lamb says that a new ice age is creeping over the northern hemisphere.
Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way. According to recent evidence, it could come sooner than anyone had expected. At weather stations in the far north, temperatures have been dropping for 30 years. Seacoasts, long free of summer ice, are now blocked year-round. According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age. If an ice age is coming, what can we do to stop it? Nuclear energy might be used to loosen polar ice caps. Sea ice could be melted by covering it with black soot to increase the absorption of sunlight.
In March of 1975, the cover of Science News featured glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. And in 1981, climatologists blamed recurring droughts and floods on a global cooling trend which could trigger massive tragedies for mankind. But by 1989, the United Nations had flipped back to global warming alarmism. They said that we had to stop global warming by the year 2000 or entire nations would be wiped off the face of the earth. This is the same prediction the White House made 20 years earlier, right before the global cooling scare started. But now Scientific American says Earth is on fire, and we broke the atmosphere by adding 1 part per 10,000 carbon dioxide to the atmosphere over the last century. To put this in perspective, the 1 part per 10,000 increase in carbon dioxide during the 20th century is equivalent to packing an extra 10 people into Wembley Stadium. 10 years ago this week, Scientific American said the Arctic was going to be ice-free by the year 2030 or 2040. But since they made that prediction in 2012, Arctic sea ice extent is up 32%. And Arctic sea ice extent is higher now than it was 15 years ago when Al Gore won the Nobel Prize. At that ceremony, he predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by the year 2014.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now. In the last few months, it has been harder and harder to misinterpret the signs that our world is spinning out of kilter.
All of their predictions failed, so now Scientific American calls all weather events climate events in an effort to blame them on the burning of fossil fuels. From a scientific point of view, none of this makes any sense. Just as Scientific American predicted 100 years ago, increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has made the world a better place for human beings. But that's no longer the agenda. The agenda is now to decrease Earth's population. 3 years ago, 11,000 academics signed an emergency declaration that Earth needs fewer people to beat the climate crisis. I'm not aware of any of them who volunteered to be personally part of that population reduction. Governments, though, are listening to them and taking action to reduce population. Governments are shutting down huge numbers of farms around the world in order to reduce emissions. As a direct result of government actions, food is becoming unaffordable for the poor and middle class. Because of government energy policy, it's now lights out at the Eiffel Tower. In May, it was predicted that 4 out of 10 British households would be facing fuel poverty this winter. And by September, that number was up to 96% for the Shetland Islands. This disastrous prediction came just a few months after Greens were bragging that the Shetland Islands were the surprising leader in the race to net zero. 100 years ago, the press was interested in improving conditions for mankind, and they knew that increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be a good thing. But now the press is controlled by a few billionaires with a different agenda. They're quite open about the fact that they want the peasants locked up in their homes. And they're using misinformation about the effects of carbon dioxide as the mechanism to achieve this. They want the peasants eating bugs while they fly around on their private jets eating steak and lobster. And it's not just the press which has been corrupted, it's also politicians and academics. A few years ago, the editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, wrote this article. The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. As one participant put it, poor methods get results. The hard work of fake journalists and fake scientists gives politicians the ability to make fake claims like this one from Barack Obama. 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. But all evidence shows the exact opposite. Conditions for humans have improved tremendously over the last century. What's dangerous for humans is bad government driven by bad journalism and bad science. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this madness for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.